Okay, so it's 2 o'clock. Let's get going. And people can just join as and when, but we will start now so that we're able to stay on time. Timing is going to be tight. I'm going to keep all these presenters to their time. So welcome to this special edition Dignity Journal presentation on the butterfly longitudinal study of sex trafficking in Cambodia. I am Helen Sworn. I'm the founder and executive director of Chab, and it was Chab as our organization that has been operating the butterfly research project for, well, on and off, but actually a little more than 10 years now. So welcome everybody. Some of you may be familiar with butterfly longitudinal research, some of you may not be. So I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to the butterfly research project. So the idea of this longitudinal research project was born from a discussion back in 2008 among a number of aftercare organizations after a research had been published that had followed the life of a survivor of sex trafficking in Cambodia, and it described her journey from the shelter where she had been one of the clients, and how well she was doing, how she ended up back in the community, had managed to get a job, had even got married. And then after a while, her past, people started to find out what had happened to her. And through that time, community members the women started shunning her, and some of the men started coming onto her. Her and her husband then moved to another community where it happened again. And eventually what happened after 5 years of what seemed like a closed case, which to many of us working in the aftercare field would have said, you know, she had everything in place, she committed suicide. And that was the catalyst for us needing to ask the hard questions of, we don't know what happens to survivors after their follow-up time with us as service providers. After the first year, maybe 2 years, we actually don't know what happens to them in their lives. We don't know whether it gets worse or whether it gets better. So at that time, what we did is we made sure that we brought this challenging conversation up among the service providers and came up with this idea of having a 10-year study that really followed the lives of survivors from when they were in the shelter to going back into the community, to really understand much more about their hopes, their fears, what were their challenges when they got back, and how did that change over time. So in 2010, the Butterfly Project was born, and worked to follow 128 survivors of sex trafficking, 80% female, 20% male, for the next 10 years. And so on this call today, we have some of the amazing authors who have written extensively on the data that has been gathered over this 10 years. And these are the authors of the journal articles that were published in the Dignity Special Edition. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Glenn Miles, who is going to present our first paper. I don't want the next generation of children to be in pain like me. Over to you, Glenn. You need to unmute yourself, Glenn. Glenn, that's it, you're muted. Glenn, you're still muted. Glenn?
Yes, sorry, I know. I'm just trying to get this. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, very good. All right. Let me just try and, that's right, good. Okay, so I'm really happy to be here with you today. This is great, and so happy. This is James and I basically spent the last year trying to get the journal special editions sorted, and we're so grateful to all of you for contributing to it. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction and overview. So basically, the majority of the project was from 2010 to 2020. Or a little bit before, a little bit after, but that's the 10 years. There were 128 children who became adult survivors of human trafficking, and particularly sex trafficking. And over the last 10 years, we've managed to collect and analyze and report on a range of different issues and topics. There were 15 associate partner NGOs which were involved in recruiting participants, referring, and also helping us with reporting. As a result, we've developed 15 NGO reports, 15 peer review papers, and at least 3 more publications to be released, including 2 in the Therapeutic Care Journal. Actually, 1 was published today, so that's interesting. And that's out of 5,000 files of data collected, so quite an impressive thing overall. So the primary purpose of the Butterfly Project was to hear directly from the participating survivors so that their voices can contribute to a greater understanding of the complexities of reintegration over 10 years. The project was NGO-led with active involvement of participating NGOs and input from university staff rather than vice versa. This meant the topics remained relevant to the evolving needs of aftercare policy and practice. And interestingly, actually, Don Hughes, who's the editor for Dignity, she was particularly interested in the NGO involvement. Good. Right. So the longitudinal research approach was between 2011 and 2013, we kind of had mixed method quantitative surveys and qualitative interviews about 3 or 4 times a year. And we had annual end of year reporting on specific issues. And then the methodology changed from 2014 to 2018, where we had biannual qualitative in-depth interviews and longitudinal quantitative surveying. And then we basically focus more on thematic reporting based on continuing partner NGO needs. So we asked participating NGOs what were the topics and issues that they were particularly concerned about, and then we focused our attention on those things. So we had a cohort of 52 that we were able to make comparative analysis over the period of time. But the qualitative data we worked with as many as we could access, i.e. those who were around. 2019, we had we celebrated the project end with the participants, and we presented the basic findings of the longitudinal results from 2012-2018, and we did a research of the research, a stakeholder analysis of the research project, which I think many of you were involved in, I think. 2021, we had, our focus has been on getting this special edition sorted. And next year, we're hoping to do a 10-year follow-up study with 52 of the Butterfly participants, who are the ones who are the most regular respondents. So some of the challenges were, of course, getting the cohort actually, them moving around a lot, trying to keep to a very strict ethical framework over 10 years, the data management security, keeping everything really secure, funding and stakeholder engagement, trying to keep everyone involved right to the end. That was challenging. And then the attrition. And that's all covered in the in the full paper. I can't go into detail now, but that's the challenges. And I'm very happy for any of you who are interested in doing longitudinal research in your context to share more detail with you on that. So we were very pleased that even in that right towards the end, we still had 71% that were actively participating in the project. And frankly, it was really in the very early stages when people dropped out rather than later on. There was good reasons why those who did drop out did. Trust was a huge thing, and we managed, the researchers did an incredible job at maintaining good relationship with participants. They did phone call follow-up, they had face-to-face interviews, day trips for participant interviews, sometimes they take them out for a meal. Then they had a kind of lay counselling support, and they promised to keep everything confidential. And they visited participants' families during fieldwork if they had permission to do so. So the contact was consistently good, and participants regularly updated their contact information with the research team. So these are some of the strict ethical, I won't go into details, but there was a national ethics committee, there were referral services, we made sure that there was complete voluntary participation, nobody without any monetary incentive, nobody did it who didn't want to do it. We were absolutely confidential about any pictures or media or anything that was said, even when the data was being collected. And we were very careful to maintain safety at all times. So yeah, a couple of the challenges were challenging maintaining good relationship with NGOs and other stakeholders over time. Some of the NGOs originally agreed in the Memorandum of Understanding to actively participate. But then when staff changed and new staff didn't understand the benefits, trying to keep their involvement was much harder than expected. So towards the end, it was hard to do that, but mostly it was good. And then the other challenge was the challenge of long-term funding. And I have to congratulate Helen Sworn on this, because she managed to continue to get funding year after year. And it was a challenge. We never really knew that whether we were going to get it or not. So we're very grateful for her being such a great assistant widow, if you like. We did have to seek funding from year to year. And basically we were in the hope that funding would be available the following year and so on. So in many ways, this made this project unique because we were effectively living by faith, but even universities find it hard to get funding for longitudinal projects these days, beyond 3 to 5 years. So it was amazing, really, what we managed to do.
1 minute. 1 minute.
Sure. So this is a quote from one of the survivors. I want to continue participating in this research because I want to tell my experiences, what I've met. I don't want the young generation to have bad experience like this. It's difficult. This experience happened to me, but I'm strong, so I'm not affected too much. In contrast, if someone is not so strong, but they meet these experiences, they'll commit suicide. It's difficult to talk about, but if we can prevent these experiences, it will be better. And it's an example of just how amazingly strong the participants were, but also how they really wanted the research to help others as well. So thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Glenn. Wonderful. So just to say now, as Jarrett starts to put his presentation up, we're going to have question and answer at the end. So this is going to be a bit like drinking from a fire hose now. You're going to have a number of presentations all in one go. And then at the end, we'll have 15 minutes or so of Q&A. So if you've got questions, make a note of them, and then we go back to them. So over to you, Jarrett, going it alone. Thank you so much.
All right. Just a second here. Can everybody hear me all right? All right, cool. Our paper arose out of a gap. Oh, just a second. Hold on. Let me get my. I want to simply move things around on my screen here. This is. If I can see my slides. There we go. Okay. Okay, this paper, our paper arose out of a particular gap that had formed in the butterfly data. And it's a gap that is by no means unfamiliar to most of us working in this field. While the Butterfly Project explored a range of thematic topics, including stigma, experiences of the judicial system, financial security, filial piety, few papers reflected on the experiences of boys. And this wasn't intentional. It was, in fact, the reality. Let's see. There we go. And out of the 128 participants, only 106 were female, or 106 were female, only 22 were boys. And at the end of the time that the paper was written, 19 boys remained. 3 of the original 22 lost contact after reintegration, one of whom has since died. And throughout the research, many moved locations. They often struggled to maintain contact with the researchers, and were described as being much less engaged in their interactions with the butterfly researchers. Responses were often just a few words, sometimes yes or no. Some took years before they began to speak. And for anyone who does social research in this field and has worked with male respondents, this is no doubt very familiar. Health research is so familiar with these challenges in working with boys and young men that they have coined their own term for it, normative male alexithymia, to describe these changes. It's something that is well documented. So we sort of dove into this gap, realizing that that the data was there were gaps in the data, there were fewer respondents, but this paper was written in response to those gaps and explores the male cohort broadly over a 6-year period, 2011 to 2016, following them through the 3 distinct phases: aftercare, reintegration, and then the life beyond is how we divided it. While the larger technical report looks at the resiliences, this one focuses largely on vulnerability in hopes to provide a better understanding of some of the gender-specific challenges faced by boys and young men who have experienced trafficking or CSEA. Some of the limitations here: boys in our sample were much younger. On average, boys were 10 to 17 years of age in 2011, and they came from one RPC program, the only one in the country at the time, which is now closed. Girls, on the other hand, were 7 to 36 years of age from 3 different diverse shelter programs. So these are different populations. So that kind of explains some of the differences here. Let me just jump right in here. So aftercare, we started in aftercare between 2001, 2013. One thing that really jumped out is physical violence and emotional violence. 58%, more than half, exhibited violence toward peers. 2/3 experienced physical violence from peers. The strong majority experienced various forms of emotional violence, largely from peers. This was tied to ethnicity, socioeconomic status. Most of them were street working, street living, coming from intense poverty situations. Physical disabilities. One of them was disabled and met a lot of struggles because of that, and being made fun of for their experience of trafficking, of exploitation, of CSEA. There's a lot to be unpacked here, which we'll get into later, talking about gender norms. Anxiety about poverty was really common, almost half of them. Family debts, worried about their families, their pressure to help support their families. And though these are kids 10 to 17 years old, much still very young. And substance abuse, 1 in every 5 struggle with substances during their time in aftercare. Then so that was their time in aftercare. Once they move back into the community, things get a little bit more chaotic for them. Moving here is huge. They're out of all the respondents, the male cohort moved very frequently, oftentimes looking for job opportunities, education opportunities. One reintegrated back to his home before high school, but the community didn't have a high school for him to go to. So they needed to move again. So a lot of them are in very far-flung areas, very deep provincial sort of areas. Depression, emotional instability, very common. Like as it says here, like majority, 1 in 5 lacking food, nearly half with insufficient education, a third unable to live with their immediate families, 95% experiencing emotional violence. A lot of this comes from their families, and then as well as from peers, but largely from families. Notable increase from aftercare. A third said that their families didn't want them reintegrated, and largely just because they weren't financially able to take care of kids, or because the child was labeled as a problem child, which once again is oftentimes something that you see with boys. You see a lot of externalized behaviors. You see a lot of, and a lot of times people just don't know how to deal with that. Physical violence, more than half still experience physical violence, difficulties with work and school, and as I mentioned earlier, housing instabilities, economic migration, moving due to violence in the home or the community, and this affects the study's attrition rate. There's also issues with jailing among the boys. So what we find is that they have poorer emotional outcomes after reintegration. And what we really find is that the experience of trafficking, the experience of CSEA is just sort of one experience in a whole pool of experiences that lots of complex overlapping traumas and an inability to struggles in forming trusting, caring relationships, struggles to find people that can really hear them out, people that they can be emotionally honest with, vulnerable to. In the life beyond period, we see a lot of this continue. 75% still struggling with poverty, 1 in 4 unable to complete school, 6 still lacking regular meals, half now separated from their family. So it has increased then in the life beyond phase. So antagonism with parents and carers, lots of devolving relationships, usually around finances, inability to earn enough money, feeling stigmatized for their exploitation. Sometimes there's a few cases, parents even stigmatize them for being abused, for allowing themselves to be abused. And that is something that I think is very unique. I mean, maybe not entirely uniquely, but it is something that I think needs to be considered uniquely for boys, especially, is the idea that a boy ought not to experience. A boy ought to be able to take care of themselves. A boy ought to be able to be strong enough to not experience sex trafficking. And some of those gendered expectations that we can, I'm happy to talk if we have time later. Go ahead. Oh, go ahead. Discussion, let me jump right in. So a lot of what we found in this centers around gender norms. The butterfly team described many of the boys as stoic or silent during their interviews, often lacking expression. Boys had very few trusting, safe, or consistent relationships. That was an overarching theme. A lot of, as I said, overlapping traumas. The previous research, butterfly research, I think we've identified some issues about pressure for the female cohort to be good daughters and good women. The reason, I think, partly the reason what
the last couple of sentences.
Okay. Okay. We find that the filial piety is still a massive thing with boys, that they do have massive pressure to earn money. And what we find is that these things that we're experiencing now, that these key points in the discussion section, I find it really interesting because these are the same key points that we have been saying for the last 10 years in local studies, regional studies, and international studies. And the question is, what has changed? Do we have, if we can get to that, I guess, in the discussion, but yeah.
You.
No worries.
I told you I was going to keep us
Quick
on.
10 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, so
No worries.
there's great things to pick up on for that. Thanks very much, Jarrett.
No worries.
This is why you can save those questions for afterwards. Okay, so we're going to move on to Todd now. So the presentation that Todd is giving us is, you can see these are all quotes, right? You have to be strong and struggle. So over to you.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Let me get my slides up here. A second. Can everyone see these?
Not yet. We can hear you, but we can't see your slides.
Okay. I'm not sure where the problem is here, Helen, so maybe
Okay.
better.
Okay, I tell you what, then we'll come back round to you. Tanya, are you ready to go?
Yeah, that's fine. Let me just share.
So we're going to move to Tanya, and the title of hers is I Don't Know Where Else to Go, Pathways to Re-Exploitation After Female Sex Trafficking Survivors in Cambodia Return Home. Thanks, Tanya.
Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, all good.
All right. So hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Tanya DeCarmo. I worked for Chab in Cambodia in the US until 2014. And I have a PhD in sociology, and I'm currently teaching legal studies at UMass Amherst. As Helen said, the title of my talk, an article in Dignity, which is co-authored with Vanntheary and Channtha, is I Don't Know Where Else to Go, Pathways to Re-Exploitation After Female Sex Trafficking Survivors in Cambodia Return Home. So for this paper, we were interested in understanding why some trafficking survivors experience re-exploitation after they receive services and return home, whereas others do not. So that is we knew that there were some participants in the butterfly research that ended up back in exploitative circumstances, either in sexual exploitation or exploitative labor. And we wanted to know what vulnerability factors this group had in common. And we also wanted to know if there were common protective factors among those who did not experience re-exploitation. As has already been stated, research on what life is like for trafficking survivors after they receive services is very limited, but even less is dedicated really to examining re-trafficking or re-exploitation. So there's few studies that are dedicated to this question, likely because it can be very difficult to trace. Survivors may want to move on with their lives without participating in research, or they may migrate again, making them difficult to find, particularly if they're engaged in exploitative labor. So information we do have, the little information we do have on re-trafficking is often anecdotal rather than systematic, and it's often taken from data on cross-border migration rather than trafficking or migration that's within borders. One of the few documented studies we do have is based on 79 cases in Eastern Europe that were documented by IOM's human trafficking database, which does suggest that sex trafficking survivors who were initially trafficked under the age of 18 are more vulnerable to re-trafficking in adult life. But still, this study was fairly limited because data came from standardized survey that was a standardized survey that was done at one point in time immediately after survivors were identified as trafficking victims. And it doesn't capture a survivor's sort of in-depth perspectives or the ebbs and flows of their longer term experiences. So to understand why some trafficked persons end up in re-exploitative circumstances after returning home while others don't, we use a method called qualitative comparative analysis. So we began with the data from the larger butterfly project, which consisted, as others have already said, of over 128 survivors interviewed multiple times per year between 2010 and 2019 or 2020. And then from this larger study, the data we used for the article in Dignity was down to a smaller selected sample of 64 females, all of whom were initially trafficked for sexual exploitation and who participated in interviews between 2010 and 2018. So for this particular analysis, we excluded male participants as well as female participants who were still living in an anti-trafficking shelter during the last year that data was collected. The reason for excluding male participants is because based on our initial analysis, we could see that gender heavily impacts post-trafficking experiences and males would require a separate analysis, which I would still like to do. And then because the purpose of the analysis was to understand what respondents' lives were like once they returned home and engagement potentially in reexploitation, not while living in a shelter, we only included females from the study who were either still living in a shelter at the end of the target period in 2017, or who did not have a sufficient number of interviews after returning to community to be comparable. And like I said, to analyze why some respondents experienced reexploitation and others didn't, we used something called fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, which I'm going to explain in a moment, which is a method developed by Charles Reagan that combines qualitative and quantitative approaches to analysis. It's one of the few analyses that's often considered well suited for analysis of causal complexity, because it looks at how factors combine together toward a common outcome rather than how a factor operates on its own toward an outcome. So each participant in the sample, including all of their interview data between 2010 and 2018, represents a single case in the study for comparative analysis for a total of 64 cases. And then for each year that respondents lived in the community away from shelters, we coded each of the 64 cases with a score in a series of category sets or variables, with scores ranging between 0, fully out of set, and 1, fully in the set. I'll provide an example of how we did that in a moment. But these category sets included demographics, such as age and gender, in addition to economic, social, and health-related variables, broadly understood by scholars and practitioners to either contribute to exploitation, such as extreme poverty or having limited formal education, or to protect against it. In addition, we scored for the outcome variables of interest, which was re-exploitation, whether they ended up in re-exploitation or not. And we hypothesized that scores of 1, so if they got a yes sort of mark in any of these risk factors, that would be associated with receiving a 1 for sex or labor exploitation. So what do I mean by that? For the category severe poverty, if a respondent experienced significant poverty in the year that was being analyzed with little or no access to food or shelter, they were given a score of 1 in the severe poverty set because severe poverty is associated with sexual.
Can you shut the door, please, Zoe?
The score 0.66 was also available for those who lived in poverty, but not as severely as those with the score of 1, and 0.33 and 0 signified different degrees of no severe poverty. So again, we hypothesized that anything scored at 1 would have an outcome of a 1 for re-exploitation. So how did we score re-exploitation? We decided to measure and use the term re-exploitation rather than re-trafficking, because in no situation was a respondent identified by the courts or local authorities as re-trafficked. And also for the purpose of understanding their experiences, we didn't really see much analytic value in having to differentiate between the two types of experiences. But we did use legal definitions to the greatest extent that we could. And we defined re-exploitation as financially motivated sexual activity or work for which the participant, 1, was either under 18 for sexual activity, since that's how exploitation trafficking are defined under the law, 2, had limited control over their work, or 3, expressed distress about their ability to leave. Because the study was designed to understand the perspectives of survivors themselves, we didn't make our own assessments, but relied on what the respondent told us.
2 more minutes, Tanya.
Okay, so I might go more quickly in the methods, but you can ask questions later if you want. So using this qualitative comparative analysis, we organized the scores into a truth table that compared respondents' experiences in these different conditions and whether they experienced the outcome, which results in sort of these pathways of combined conditions. And for re-exploitation, we found that approximately 23% or 15 of the respondents experienced re-exploitations. Of these, only 3 had declined assistance. So many of the people in the study who did receive services also experienced re-exploitation. And one of the interesting findings is that economic poverty was necessary, but not sufficient for re-exploitation, meaning that everyone who experienced re-exploitation was experiencing poverty, but poverty alone did not explain re-exploitation, because there were a lot of people who experienced poverty but were not re-exploited. Another interesting finding was that social protections, such as marriage and having a child, were surprisingly significant for no exploitation, which we did not expect. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the pathways we saw for re-exploitation included living in poverty with no child, low education, low social support, and violence, or poverty while sending remittances to family, low education, low social support, and physical violence and emotional violence, as well as high poverty and debt and remittances with no child, low education, and violence.
1 minute.
Okay, I'm not going to do the no re-exploitation. So I think the main takeaways here are that there are forms of social inequality, such as being isolated, that contributes to re-exploitation rather than just economic, such as poverty, and that social ties to family and community provide broad social protection in Cambodian society, and that there's a distinguished importance between social support, which NGOs provide, as well as social protections that people experience in the community, such as having ties to family and the community that can also protect them from further exploitation. I'm happy to answer questions later on, maybe on the recommendations later. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya.
Mhm.
Great. Okay. So Todd, are you all okay? You back online? Back online there?
Yes, I am. Let me give it a shot here. If the
Okay,
permissions don't work out, we can just try again, but hopefully this will work this time.
Okay. Okay. We just never know what technology is going to do, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Can
this is positive. Yeah, great. Off you
all
go.
right, good.
Thank you very much, Todd. So Todd's paper is "You Have to Be Strong and Struggle."
All right, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody out there. My name is Todd Morrison, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our research. Let me get this full screen up. Here we go. Our research was looking at stigmas, and the paper we put together is entitled "Stigmas as Determinants of Inequality for Female Survivors of Sex Trafficking." Our research question, what we focused on, was what are the experiences, perceptions, and responses of female survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking to stigma in the community following reintegration in Cambodia. Our cohort group we focused on was 15 female study participants from the overall group that reintegrated from the years 2011 to 2014. And the average age of the group that we worked with was 21.5 years old. And importantly here, they all identified as ethnically Khmer, or at least part ethnically Khmer. We conducted the thematic assessment to look at stigma and to look at survivors' experiences with stigma, discrimination, and who was a part of that in their life. For all 56 study participants, and it amounted to 169 individual years of narrative data with multiple interviews and data sources for the cohort. So I thought I would break this presentation down into just talking about 4 key findings and some of the information that went along with that key finding, and then a little bit of a discussion of our recommendation for folks who are doing more direct practical work with survivors of human trafficking. So I just wanted to let you guys know there's plenty of other details in the paper itself, and these are just some of the findings that we had. So the first key finding is that survivors contend with multiple sources of stigma. And I think that maybe that seems pretty simple or obvious, but if you look back in the research and over time for stigma in human trafficking and the research that's out there, you find that there's not a lot. Even 10 years ago, we saw a lot of information that was sort of like there's discrimination associated with survivors that go back into their communities. That was often in reports and sort of gray literature. And just probably the last 5 to 7 years, people have started to actually do some good research on this. And really the research has started with one type of stigma, or maybe 2 or 3 types of stigma, or stigma within the service communities, or stigma within the governments and systems. And our goal here was to actually try and put together a more comprehensive look at stigma, put together what we would call like a conceptual model of stigma, and look at it in Cambodia with these survivors and see major causes, stigma causes. And for our study, we found that the majority of the cohort group spoke about stigmatizing experiences. So 70% of the females responded sometime during reintegration with a story about a stigmatizing experience. And when you looked at all of the different types or what they discussed, we could boil that down into 4 main stigma causes for survivors. Gender, stigmas associated with gender, stigmas associated with sex work, stigmas associated with socioeconomic status, and marriageability. One of the recommendations I would give with this key finding is to practitioners to really look at all levels of stigma and understand that, you know, if we're looking at people who are trafficked in their own country, we need to understand the types of stigmas people face in that country, as well as the stigmas they may face through the human trafficking experiences they've encountered. And if they're trafficked into another country, we have a whole set of other stigma and potential stigmatizing experiences somebody could be open to or run into. So this is, this is something important for all I think all practitioners to remember, that understanding stigma on all levels and the cultural impacts of stigma for the particular group you're working with. And also, I think it's important to look at the age groups as well, and certainly the gender of the people that you're working with. So that's the first key finding. I think it skipped here. The second key finding is that family is the most important group shaping stigma causes and contributing to positive or negative outcomes for survivors long term. At some point of time in our life, families play an important role in shaping stigma. I think they play that important role in all of our lives. So we understand our life through what our family teaches us when we're young and our community around us, and that doesn't stop, right? We have our family to support us as we go through our life, and certainly this is the case with the cohort group here. Family was the most important group shaping the stigma causes and contributing to positive and negative outcomes for the survivors and their narrative stories. It was clear that survivors were conscious of negative stereotypes in their home communities. They discussed them when they were young, who were working in the sex industry, and then realizing themselves that they were a part of that. And so they struggled with self-stigmatizing thoughts and labels. And certainly some literature out there does talk about that it's one of the major concerns for people as they come back, as they're repatriated, concerns about how they'll be received. And certainly that's then looked through the eyes of certain failed migration and things like that. So family can be the most important group also in helping people through, and certainly family and partners or even in-laws unfortunately perpetuated 61% of the observations of discrimination that the cohort received. So the family here was unfortunately very significant in the negative outcomes for survivors here. And then a recommendation would be to understand family connections, safely engage family members, and help equip survivors to recognize and develop supportive relationships. These would be essential parts to any reintegration program. And really being able to work with the family and understand what the families will support and don't support is going to be key in helping people as they go back in the community. So that's the second one. The third one is sort of the findings of all the research together. Stigmas associated with human trafficking are fundamental determinants of social inequality for survivors. If you look at the big picture stigma research, you realize that stigma has been researched for race and found to be a fundamental determinant of social inequality for race and social economic status for people and for gender. And the weight of evidence from this paper suggests that stigmas associated with human sexual trafficking are also a fundamental determinant of social inequality for survivors here, particularly in Cambodia and probably in other places as well. The stigmas associated with sex work were intense and persistent in our paper, and we found that they were layered over the existing cultural stigmas that people would talk about, and making them far more complex than they were before. And they were connected, unfortunately, with a wide variety of societal discrimination and disadvantaged outcomes in education, in relationships, with divorces, and in marital rights, and gender-based violence. And so those were sort of the basic conclusions that came in the paper, the findings and the discussion. And I think one of the recommendations that would come out of this would be to look at some of the other stigma research that's gone on. There's been a lot of stigma research out there, and there's been good research on the practices for anti-stigma interventions, and certainly any anti-stigma interventions targeting gender equality and gender-based violence in countries like Cambodia or even here in Bangladesh would be important and appropriate in helping survivors of human sexual trafficking reintegrate back into society.
2 minutes, Todd.
Okay, thank you. The last key finding is that survivors that overcame stigma shared some similar resilience traits. And as part of the study, we were able to look back through some of the other thematic papers that were written about resilience and look at some of the survivors that actually did well or came through stigma situations or really had no trouble with stigma, didn't even discuss it, and what were some of the traits, some of the resilience traits that they embodied the most. And so we put down here four of the main ones. The first one is interconnectedness. Again, this really references families and healthy, strong, encouraging relationships. In Cambodia, having good relationships and having relationships with your family are sort of the backbone of their society, and helping in times of like when people are sick or in stressful crisis times, the family is what comes together. And so survivors that had a strong interconnected set of family, or a husband that was strong and trusting and encouraging, or a set of friends that were strong and trusting and encouraging, they often were able to come through experiences or put these experiences behind them, sort of rise above them. Others also describe forms of mental strength, and mental strength here would be able to think about the self-stigmatizing thoughts and change those thoughts, and instead of letting them sort of weaken you, become strong. And there's a lot of good quotes in the paper about being strong. Certainly almost every one of these survivors had to work hard and struggle, and those are resilience attributes that many survivors reflect on when they're asked to give advice to others. And all the ones who were excelling had learned a trade or were growing in their work and felt like they had earned honor through the choices they made. In Cambodia, there's an honor system for folks who have work and who can support themselves and who can support their families. And the survivors that were able to enter into that certainly felt like they had earned back their honor in the society and sort of overcome some of the stigmas they faced when they first reintegrated or when they first came back from their trafficking experiences. So
thank you, Todd.
I think that is something, just that we would do to identify important resilience traits in the programs we're working with to foster them. And so, great.
Very good.
Anybody wants to talk more? Perfect. Thank you.
We'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. That's great. Thank you so much. I did warn everybody, this is drinking from the hose, right? Fire hose today. So we're gonna shift over to Julia, and Julia is gonna present on why am I the only one responsible for the whole family.
Thanks, Helen. You can see my screen?
Yeah, all good.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Julia Smith-Brake, and I will be presenting this paper on behalf of my co-writers, Vanntheary and Channtha. So the purpose of this paper was to situate economic reintegration of survivors in the broader context of their sense of obligation to their family, and more specifically to their parents and caregivers. So as you might have heard through the last few presentations, family and filial piety have come up a lot. And so this paper sought to examine how financial anxiety relates to multiple factors, including this sense of obligation that survivors have towards their family. We sought to understand how survivors both explain and experience their filial duty and how it influences their reintegration journey. You can see a few of the definitions that we worked with around. So filial piety, of the overarching notion that children have obligations towards their parents and how that is experienced in Cambodia, and specifically financial filial piety in survivors' experiences. I'll quickly say a short word about the methodology. We used a sub-cohort of 77 participants because we were really looking at the reintegration experience. And so the data set that we were working with in 2015 and 2016, we wanted to kind of cut it off at a certain point. And so it was female participants who had already left the shelter or who had never been in a shelter experience. We used thematic analysis, starting with some overarching themes of seeking to understand the experience of economic reintegration and that family obligation. And then we used Bryman's stages of analysis to narrow down the different subcategories within financial anxiety, economic stability or instability, and filial piety, including feelings of financial obligation. So I'm going to jump right into the findings because I know that 10 minutes can go by really quickly. The findings were divided into some of these subcategories. And so first of all, we looked at what was the actual experience of giving money or giving remittances from survivors to their families. And then what was that sense of responsibility? Because sometimes survivors felt the responsibility to give financially to their families, but were unable to do so. And that itself led to a lot of expressions of guilt. And so there were high instances throughout the qualitative data. Basically, we looked at every piece of qualitative data, all interviews, all focus group discussions that were conducted over the 4-year period. So high instances of women giving or sending money to their parents or caregivers. And as we say, Todd, put family in quotations, and that is true because oftentimes it was an actual parent, a mother. Sometimes it was someone who was a caregiver, so an aunt, a grandmother. But that kind of larger sense of family, there were high instances of feeling responsible for their family's well-being, but specifically for their family's financial well-being. And then associated with those feelings of responsibility were also common expressions of guilt and worry associated with their family's financial situation, regardless of whether they lived with their family. And so in the spirit of sharing the words of survivors, I'm in each finding, I want to share some of their own words and how they expressed these themes and findings themselves. And so this one was, I felt the burden to carry all these responsibilities. I felt upset, I cried, I suffered. Why am I the only one responsible for the whole family? And this spirit, this expression came up very often. So then we kind of went out, panned out a little bit and just looked at general feelings towards families. And so we coded every instance of any time a survivor talked about their family, what were the themes that came out. And so there were definitely feelings of guilt coupled with often feelings of mistrust. But as we all know, I'm sure we can all relate with having complex feelings towards our family. And so there were often feelings of course, I love my parents, I feel loved, I feel cared for, but then there were always coupled with also these feelings of guilt and feelings of heavy burden. We conducted one specific focus group discussion with a group of reintegrated working survivors about this idea of filial piety and of family obligation. And what came out of that focus group discussion was very much that the obligation towards the family was taken on willingly. If a word in a focus group discussion question was used the word owe or debt towards one's family, the participants really balked at that. And they did not want to name it a debt or an owing. They used the words responsibility and obligation, but then the impacts of that obligation were unilaterally expressed in the negative, using words such as heavy, complicated, torn, a burden. And in the words of one survivor, obligation is our duty that we need to be responsible in our family. So related with this, the actual financial obligation part of it was the finding around debt repayment and anxiety. So the vast majority of participants expressed worrying about repaying debt, but their own and their families. Half of participants at any time throughout the study reported being in debt, and also debt was cyclical and related to everyday living. So there were sometimes different shocks that happened, but often it's just how I get from one month to the next. And debt included their own and their families. And the quote for this one was, "My family has a lot of problems, no income, and a lot of debt as my mother does gambling. I feel very hurt about it. I am emotionally hurt by my family's matters." And finally, okay, I'm going. And then finally, this is all related to then the financial anxiety that is felt. So generally, this cohort worried and had fear about money. Talking about money led them to express being scared, being uncertain about the future, especially after reintegration. And then the financial anxiety was related to the filial piety. So the anxiety and burden for carrying one's family's economic well-being were expressed multiple times, and often those expressions were shared unprompted and not in response to a specific question about their family's financial situation. I have so many responsibilities. So if I have the capability, in other words, a higher economic status, I wouldn't feel stress. If I have no ability to handle it, I get aggressive. And sometimes when I cannot control my feelings, I throw my anger on my children. So survivors often had this dual expression of being worried and scared about money, and then having a lot of psychosocial problems. There was suicidality, there was depression, there was fear and anxiety. So the sense of responsibility was actually real, not perceived. Many of the women were actually financially supporting their families. They were putting off their own plans in favor of their families. And so really, it comes as no surprise that the main conclusion of the paper was that the majority of survivors express financial anxiety and function under this burden of filial piety. And that poses great challenges to their economic well-being in reintegration. And family is central. Family is a central focus and influencer of a Cambodian survivor's economic reintegration process. And family must be central in any services assessment and support that we provide.
Great. Perfect point to end, Julia. Thank you so much. This is amazing, right? Okay, so now we are going to move on to Hanny, who is going to be looking at some of the their health, social determinants of health. So when they see someone who is poor, they step on them. So thanks so much, Hanny.
Thank you. And I'm just trying to cue my screen so I can actually see my notes at the same time. But as I'm doing that, I just wanted, I'm just so excited to be part of all of this work. Thank you so much for inviting me to this table. As Glenn said in the comments, we really miss James here. So a shout out to James. This work would not be possible without him. And of course, without the large team that was dedicated to this project over years. And the survivors themselves. So I really appreciate you allowing me to be part of this particular analysis process. So my this subset of research was focused on the social determinants of health. And for those who are not familiar with what the social determinants of health are, they're defined as the non-medical yet health affecting conditions of a person's life. And when you think about your own life, how many things play into your mental and physical health? And we were looking specifically at those pieces in our data set. So our aim was to explore the social determinants of health impacting those who have survived sex trafficking in Cambodia. And we started off first looking at existing conceptual frameworks of how at the WHO level, social determinants of health are seen to interplay with health factors. And based on this, you can see that there are lots of arrows going a lot of different ways here. And this is what we also saw within the subset that we looked at with where whether it be socioeconomic and political context, socioeconomic position, social class and gender, ethnicity, all of these things are echoing what I've been hearing in a lot of the presentations as well. So here was our modified framework, and you can see all of the outside things and then kind of going inwards, how these are at different levels of what we saw with the WHO framework and all interrelated. There was an earlier version of this framework that had 5 million arrows that were going all these different ways with pluses and minuses. And we decided this was the simplest way to present the data. But as you can imagine, these are complicated, and there's a spectrum of impact from each of these different social determinants of health in the study. You know, the quote that we led with in the title of our paper and then for this presentation really gets at the social class piece that many folks have been talking about. And I think this quote here really exemplifies that. When they see someone who's poor, they step on them. And it gets at the experiences of stigma and discrimination in society, including labels that some folks used in terms of feeling like they had bad karma or that they were considered promiscuous. And these were words that community members or family members would use in describing them. I'm not going to go into detail on gender and age because these have come out in other presentations here. And I'm really excited for our discussion around each of these components. Race has been touched on briefly in our discussion thus far, and I just wanted to bring to the fore this quote from a survivor that kind of gives two elements, both in terms of documentation status and how that was interrelated with ethnicity. He was of Vietnamese ethnicity, and even in getting documents for his certificate of residence, he had to pay more because of his Vietnamese ethnicity to get those documents. So it's just another socioeconomic impact that's interrelated with different ethnicity. And of course, he needed to not be stateless in order to be able to actually work. And speaking of work, vocational training was something that came up a lot. We know that many of these individuals who had gone through vocational training programs of some shape or other, there's a lot of variability in quality, but we found that only a small number of survivors actually had sustained employment using skills that they had learned from these courses. And this is a quote from a survivor, a participant, who said that she was in this group that had 3 other women had studied running their own business, their own salon, and she's the only one that's continuing to do that work. A common theme was low wage work as well. And you can see here how it was really barely enough to cover basic expenses, including access to food and water, and in some cases wasn't able to cover that. But this one individual describes working 2 shifts, wanted to be able to work even more, and feels like he can't survive because I need to spend money on my family, on gasoline and food and other expenses. And this really impacted this woman's mental health. And as we saw in the previous presentation, I'm totally dependent on my husband now. If I stop working and live with my husband, I could reach a successful life, but I'm dependent on him and I cannot achieve or envision because I'm making a living for each day and I cannot think about a success plan. So really impacting mental health. This is a comparison of what we knew about work status between 2012 and 2018, and I'm not going to go through that in detail. And then on the health side, there was a lot of information, and I was forced to cut out a lot for the purposes of this presentation. Happy to answer some in the Q&A. But one of the things that we wanted to highlight that was a theme that we saw come forth was a lack of knowledge around contraception and how that could really impact someone's health and well-being. And it was this complex interplay, and I think this quote really gets at it, among not really having much knowledge about sexually transmitted infections in some cases, not knowing about contraception, and then an overlay of medical beliefs and religious understandings of contraception. And so this person was worried about and felt like her body would be negatively impacted by contraception, and that they would use the natural method, and that had in the past for this individual resulted in them having an unsafe abortion that wasn't provided by a normal medical doctor. But this sort of cycle of not also wanting to, being afraid of engaging with contraception. And so there's just like a lack of knowledge here that we wanted to highlight. So I don't think I introduced myself at the top, but I'm an emergency medicine physician and a professor at Harvard Medical School, and CEO of Heal Trafficking. And I believe the only solution to ending trafficking is a public health approach. And I think this study really underlines the role of social determinants of health in that. And unless we and the big collective we of society is committed to addressing these underlying vulnerabilities, we're never going to end the cycle of exploitation and trafficking.
2 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, just wrapping up here, we had a number of recommendations that came out of our findings for different sectors, just to highlight the recommendations for healthcare, including the Ministry of Health, really that access piece. And by access, and we're not just talking about physical access, but access that's low cost, that's non-judgmental. Survivors described a number of horrible experiences of being laughed at in the healthcare setting, and that should never be the case. And access to comprehensive medical and physical services as well. And then these were our recommendations for aftercare NGOs. And I think this also just goes to society as well. How do we create those conditions that prevent someone from being exploited? But thinking about really on those structural levels, access to basic fundamental needs in a quality way, regardless of whether somebody's in an urban or a rural setting. Education was a common, lack of education was a common barrier that was cited, where people had to decide whether once they were out of the care of an NGO, whether they were going to go to school, which they couldn't afford to do, or to continue working in a low wage sector, and how can NGOs be a better part of that solution, as well as thinking more strategically about what those vocational skills are that are transferred while someone's under the care of an NGO, and potentially even how do we on a long-term basis have touch points with survivors so that maybe they're at that stage of building their resume or needing to practice for an interview, that they have that support as they progress in their vocational work. And then finally, that contraception education should be a vital part of aftercare programming. So I will close there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Channy. Okay. And last but not least, the next presentation I'm actually going to play on my screen in one moment is I Want Justice from people who did bad things to children. So I am just going to share my screen now. Here we go. Hoping that this will work.
Hello everyone, so stay. I hope you're all well. My name is John. I'm one of the authors from the Butterfly Project. It really was an honour for me to be part of this amazing and valuable project. And my apologies for not being with you live today. Put together this presentation of the paper we wrote, which focused on the experiences of justice for sex trafficking survivors, primarily in Cambodia. As they're not there in person, please feel free to contact me in the address noted here. So, briefly, to give you an overview of the study, the research population was made up of 93 of the overall 128 butterfly participants, 88 for which were survivors of sex trafficking. There were 76 female and 17 male participants. 82 were Cambodian nationals and 11 were Vietnamese. Data was compiled from 2 rounds of qualitative interviews conducted between 2016 and 2017. These lasted between 45 and 75 minutes each. Just to move into the findings then, of the participants, there were 32 survivors who had direct experience of being in court. Feelings of fear and worry were present among many of these. The main court outcomes were the imprisoning of perpetrators and the awarding of monetary compensation to survivors, although monies weren't necessarily received by survivors. Survivors had mixed reactions to their perpetrator being imprisoned. Some associate this with feelings that they'd received justice, while there were some occasions where survivors expressed guilt and pity in relation to family members being imprisoned. Compensation was often awarded but seldom obtained, things like 3 occasions. There was a general need to return to court in order to obtain compensation, which proved to be a major barrier for many. Compensation wasn't always desired either, as this poignant quote illustrates. I don't like to get money from my case. It seems like I got money in exchange for my loss. Here the survivor forced the survivor compensation for losing her virginity didn't feel appropriate. Regarding courtroom practices, it was common for survivors to be in close proximity to their perpetrators in the courtroom in Cambodia. Some survivors described their treatment in court and the language used towards them, and this was associated with fear, worry, and shame. There were examples of positive protective practices in the courtroom, for example, the effective management of the courtroom to ensure survivors and perpetrators were not in close proximity. This is done by erecting barriers between survivors and perpetrators, utilising safe and confidential spaces, and using pre-recorded statements. There was a high instance of participants illustrating a low level of understanding of the justice process in general. NGO support was identified as being essential for many, especially with respect to the identification of survivors, access to legal processes, cost protection, support, all to navigate through the various stages of litigation. There were 16 cases where survivors had begun legal processes but did not proceed to court, primarily due to survivors' multifaceted fear. Some weren't required to attend court. There was one case which was settled through community mediation. 21 survivors did not want to take legal action despite being exploited, mainly due to fear again. Other reasons included financial and opportunity costs involved, or because survivors did not understand legal processes. 16 survivors didn't feel that they had been exploited. 16 participants didn't feel that they'd been exploited. This included 5 children who were actually exploited. These introduced questions regarding agency and how children can find it okay or necessary to have to engage in prostitution. Fatalistic views were common throughout the study. This could be seen as a barrier to bring about change, or also these views could be seen as the true illustration of reality of pursuing justice in Cambodia. The common belief was rich would always win. Their status is higher than us. When there's someone backing them with a higher authority, they will be the winner. If you don't have money, social capital, or from a marginalized population, there's general perception that justice was beyond your reach. One of the themes that emerged during the research was the complexity associated with trafficking and the family. It's important for anyone supporting a survivor in this situation to be aware of these complexities. There are 5 cases of trafficking being facilitated by family members. These quotes provide illustrations of how complex obtaining justice is for survivors who've been trafficked by family members, and even speak for themselves. They asked if I wanted to get compensation. I didn't understand. Who should I ask for compensation? My mother was the one who brought me in. If they arrested her, who would take care of my younger brother or sister? What would happen to them? Okay, so finally, just to go through some the recommendations I've condensed and categorized into 4 main topics below. First, looks at awareness in a general sense. Education and information should be provided about rights and the justice system in general, possibly through campaign work or these topics be included in the national curriculum. Specifically for survivors of sexual exploitation engaged in legal processes, court preparation is a valuable way to alleviate their fears and manage expectations. It needs to be as simple as just role plays or showing pictures of court prior to their court cases to provide level of familiarity. Legal information must be provided and understood. It's important to manage survivors' expectations and for them to effectively manage justice processes. There are risks to children survivors during the court processes, and particularly child survivors, as they can be left feeling disconnected or if they haven't experienced justice at all. Participation, a survivor needs to actively participate and make decisions throughout their justice journeys. All stakeholders are responsible to ensure this happens at each stage of a survivor's journey. Support and safety. Survivors felt most protected when they had support and encouragement and when were aware of the court proceedings. Survivors were assisted, supported, protected throughout their legal journeys, and the main providers of support are NGOs, although there appears to be a level of dependency on NGOs. Survivors will also support face many barriers to access to justice. Court procedures, including concerning safety and confidentiality must be strengthened. Intimidation, interrogation, as cross-examination tactics within the Cambodian legal justice must stop. A robust enforced code of conduct should be developed and adhered to by all legal stakeholders. There needs to be a higher instance of the use of pre-recorded statements on the abuse of technology, etc. When a perpetrator has been released, survivors should be informed, supported, and should receive guidance regarding how to deal with this situation. Effective victim identification is essential. Alongside this, there needs to be an effective child protection system in place. For example, in this research, with children remaining in abusive and exploitative situations even after being identified by the authorities. Finally, the bigger picture, I suppose, the overarching aim for Cambodia is to develop trust in the legal system, which will require high level of leadership and accountability. In the context of sex trafficking, will involve a shift in attitudes and treatment of survivors of sexual exploitation. I know Glenn and James are with you and maybe able to respond to any questions you might have. Otherwise, please don't hesitate to send me an email. And before I finish, I'd like to say a big thank you to Vanntheary, Channtha, James, Glenn, and all the research team. Most importantly, to all the participants of the Butterfly Project who've provided a true voice to all survivors of sexual exploitation. I'm humbled to have had the opportunity to share your powerful stories. All the best, everyone, and mind yourselves.
Okay. Right. So that was phenomenal, right? I mean, just so amazing to have all of those presentations. They each could have had probably an hour and a half on their own, but here we are. So we are going to jump into the next kind of like 13, 14 minutes of Q&A. We actually had our first question came in from Alistair. So Alistair, I'm just going to, shall I just read your question or did you want to?
You can read it, but if you struggle to read it, I can help.
Okay. Jarrett mentioned that with the boys, the data gatherers and interviewers often found the boys to be stoic, fairly non-verbal, reluctant to talk. This does not come as a surprise to me at all. So my question is, taking this into consideration, how did the team adapt the way they worked with boys in terms of the methodology as the research progressed in order to take these difficulties into consideration, e.g. gender adaptations? And secondly, when training the researchers, what preparation did this include for working with boys specifically? Glenn, did you want to start with this? I still can't hear you. Glenn.
Yeah, I think the challenge with this is that over the period of time of the survey, we had different researchers involved in it, and we did have the guys in the team to do it, but I would say they had varying degrees of training in specifically working with boys. And that's actually a very good question. I think that there was still an increase in trust over time, but it's just because they were you know, it was over a longer period of time, but yeah, it still wasn't the same as with girls. Have you got anything else to say, Jarrett, about that?
Yeah, that is a I mean, I think that is a familiar issue, I think, with a lot of research, that it's more than just I think that's this was a part of the learning experience. I think doing a lot of this, I was really just a part of the data, the analysis and the writing. But in all of the research, most of my research is on this type of issue. I know that this is it is very very common that social workers don't have training in this, and just because services are inclusive of boys doesn't mean that the support workers or researchers or services are aware of their needs or able to empathize with what they're feeling. So there's a lot of challenges, and I think we recognize that. I think that the ethical protocol of the study recognized a lot of gaps in our own capacities. But I think the one thing that we can take from this is that the gaps are in just about every aspect of it, from the programming to the specialists to the training, the education that people receive, is that boys just are not considered greatly in this field as vulnerable persons when it comes to sexual violence. Yeah. But not necessarily not necessarily, but it's something that is I think a challenge in research, and it's something that I think we hope that this study can maybe improve based on our findings and our gaps.
Yeah, great. And I can say from, obviously I didn't sit in the room with the team, but I know even from the recruitment side, when Phally joined the team, he was able to really have a lot more of those conversations with the rest of the team. But it was something that we really learned as we went, Alistair, and I think that there would be greater lessons learned if we were starting again. But great question, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? I've got a couple for Tanya. So I'm going to have Hanny. Would you like to present your question to Tanya?
Sure. You, Tanya, I know you got cut off in terms of time, and you were just about to it was like this cliffhanger, like you were about to present the other group's results. So I was just wondering if you could share that, because I think that comparative analysis just like so fascinating, and I would just love to hear what you learned.
I'm going to share again that particular slide. If you guys, you can see it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So for the no re-exploitation, the factors contributing were no debt, or all of these are ors, right? And so each line is one combined sort of package of factors. So the first one being no debt, or having a child with social support, or not sending remittances to family and having a child, or being married and having a child, or being single, not living in poverty and having social support. So the child and family factors were completely surprises to us. We did not, in fact, we thought having a child might contribute to re-exploitation because of the financial burden, and a lot of the respondents' marriages are troubled, so we didn't necessarily expect that marriage would be a protective factor. So what we decided, going back to the data, is that probably what's happening here is that it doesn't mean that marriage or parenthood are always positive, but that there's some sort of broad social protections that being married or being a mother provides for women in Cambodian society to some extent. I saw that someone also asked about recommendations, and that's tied into this. So let me jump ahead to that really fast. So one of the differentiations we made then was based on this finding, we should be thinking about, and supports that NGOs can provide in the community, as well as ways that we can be leveraging community strengths and family strengths within the communities to support reintegrated survivors. So maybe, either building up social family ties that people already have in the community, or if somebody doesn't have those and are isolated, trying to build help them build their own social networks in the community where they can have these healthy social and family ties, maybe with friends or community members, which I know that programs do, but maybe narrowing in on those sort of building, strengthening communities, having that be more of a priority for aftercare, not only for prevention, right? So the recommendations being prioritizing, maintaining social ties to family and community, thinking about social supports, not only economic or education, though low education was a pathway to re-exploitation, it wasn't having an education was not a pathway to not re-exploitation, which suggests that maybe the types of education that are being provided aren't giving that boost. So that could be one possibility there. And then also thinking about how we might improve policies to address social and structural inequality more broadly to address trafficking rather than only criminal responses. So really empowering communities and investing there.
Julia, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I find it so fascinating, you know, like we've all worked on these different papers and there's so many kind of common threads going through, even though we're looking at it from different lenses. And what you're saying, Tanya, really resonates, and also surprising that if they had a child and were married, they were less likely to be re-exploited. And one of the conclusions, which I think you can kind of read, but I wasn't able to share from the filial piety paper, was survivors are continually negotiating the balance between their own agency and their perceived or real need to sacrifice for their own goals for the sake of their family. And in the instances, we definitely saw survivors who like directly said, I cannot get married yet. I cannot have children yet. I cannot pursue my own educational goals yet because I need to still care for my family. Yeah. And so I think that there's some real alignment and linkages between those findings. It's really interesting.
Right.
I agree.
So Choi put a question in for you, Tanya. Seems to be that you're the one getting the questions. Regarding the 62 survivors, 23% are re-exploited. My question is there any article or follow-up research to know about the life journey after they are re-exploited? That's
I mean, so within the study we have within Butterfly, obviously our team tried to follow up with them as often as they could and as much as they could, even after people were back in exploitation. And that happened in many, not all, but in many cases, we were able to continue to connect with those people. Sometimes they might have disappeared for some time and come back, but it's a good question. And also one thing I didn't mention, that the data I shared today is one point in time, and that was in 2017, I believe. But we did score everyone for every year. And so I want to do an analysis. There's a way you can do QCA with the temporal element to see how time factors into things, because there are some people in the study that experienced re-exploitation and then weren't a year later or 2 years later. And so like things are changing all the time. And so obviously their lives aren't static, just like all of us. So it's a good question. Obviously it'd be wonderful to be able to continue to follow up with them in a longer term, which, I mean, I don't know how possible that is, but hopefully one day we can do that, right?
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a couple more minutes left. Any other questions? While you're thinking, we are going to be obviously keeping this recording, and all of the presentations that the researchers have presented today will be available after this. So we will be able to post a link to it on social media. But if you'd like to receive them directly, just put your email in the chat, and then we will make a note of all of those emails, and then we can send you all of the information, and you can come back to us if you have any questions afterwards as well. Glenn.
Yes, I just put this in the chat, but all of you who are still here are key stakeholders, and if any of you've got questions you would like us to include in the survey next year, please send them to me and we'll see if we can include them. This is, if you remember, there were 52 who regularly responded, and we only have a limited amount of time next year to do the data collection, but the intention is that we try to connect with those 52, because then we can make comparisons between the survey that was done in 2012 to 2022. So if you can send those to me, that would be great. Thank you.
Glenn, do we, out of those 52 participants, what's the gender breakdown? Do we know?
I can't remember, sorry.
I just thought that would be really
Good
interesting.
question, yeah.
Because I think we've got some, I really love the idea, Tanya, that you would be willing in your maybe spare time, to do this paper with the male participants. Maybe Jarrett or Alistair or somebody else may jump in on that if they're interested.
I would love that.
Do a collaborative paper. Oh, thumbs up from Alistair. Take his name.
Sounds good, Alistair.
Okay. Can I just say, this is amazing. I know that James is gutted that he's not here with us today. And I do want to give him a shout out. And so this has been a journey. The longitudinal research has been a journey. Glenn and James pushing forward for this Dignity article has been a journey. And I love that we're able to do some more follow-up with some of the cohort next year. And who knows, maybe even after then, if they're still willing to be part of research. So thank you so much to the authors for literally giving your time with no remuneration, for putting hours and hours into this Dignity articles. You really truly kind of just put your on your very busy lives have done this extra work, and I'm so grateful. And yeah, I think that this has been a phenomenal research project, and I don't see that this is the end of it yet. So thank you everybody for coming. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thank you especially to Glenn for pulling all of this together, for his stamina and perseverance in bossing us around to get it done.
Hi.
Have an amazing rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Have a good
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop recording.